This tutorial picks up where the basic compositing tutorial left off. If you didn't do that tutorial, you can find this file by clicking on the link in the description. So what we need to do now is make these two images look like they were shot together in the same space and time. So right away I see there's some problems. First of all, the car layer is much more saturated and contrasty than the sand dunes. If you hold down the Shift key, you can click on the mask of the car and see what the original image looks like. And we can see that there's a lot of blue and a lot of red in this image. So we're going to have to take most of that out. The background is very neutral and very muted. The background's also a lot less contrasty. So let's begin with the background by trying to add contrast and saturation. So I'll click on the dunes layer, and I'm going to add an adjustment layer. There are several ways you can get to your adjustment layers. You could click here and use these symbols, or you can just click on this circle right here. In this case, I'm going to start out with a levels. The way the levels works is in the RGB mode, what we see here is a histogram, and by moving the sliders in the histogram, we can change the overall contrast of the image. This bar down here controls the overall brightness. And as we're going to see in a few minutes, if we go into the individual channels, we can modify the color. In this case, I'm more interested in modifying the contrast. So I want to try and increase the contrast, get some deeper shadows in here. I think that looks pretty good. So I'm going to say OK to that. Now I also want to add saturation. So I'll come in here to the hue saturation adjustment layer and crank up the middle one here, which is saturation. Somewhere around there. Now as we do that, you notice we start getting very noticeable banding in the sky. So that's something we're going to have to address later on. Okay, now let's start on the car. It's going to make things a lot easier if we separate the dust cloud from the car and we address each one separately. So I'm going to duplicate the car layer by pressing Command J, and I will turn off the upper layer and just focus now on the bottom layer. And this layer, I'm just really interested in the dust cloud here and not the car. I'm going to start also with a levels. Now in this case, I want this to be a layer clipping mask. I'll show you what happens. If I just apply the levels and adjust the contrast, it affects the background as well as the car, and I don't want it to do that. I just want to modify the car and the dust. So we need to make this a layer clipping mask. The layer clipping mask will make it so that this layer only affects the layer directly below it. So here's the layer clipping mask, Command Option G. So I'll press Command Option G, and now this is only going to affect the car and the dust. Let's just lighten it up a little bit overall, and now we want to go in and modify the color. This is an RGB image, so we'll have a red, green, and blue channel. Now most of us are unfamiliar with mixing colors using red, green, and blue. We're familiar with pigments, which would be CMYK, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. But these correspond to CMYK. They're just opposite. So let's say we wanted to take out yellow. I would go CMY. I'd go down to the blue channel. And one way is going to make it more blue, and the other way is going to make it more yellow. So I want to take out yellow, so I'm going to slide it to the left a little bit. And now I want to take out magenta, so I'll go to the green channel, pull out some of the magenta. I also want to neutralize this a little bit, so I'm going to add a hue saturation to this one as well, and pull out some saturation here. I'm going to make sure I'm going to pull that out a little bit to get it more neutral. And now I'm going to use a paint layer. I'll name this one Paint Top of Dust. Say OK. sample a light color from the sand dunes, and then I'm going to paint across the top here. I have this on a pretty low flow. Maybe I'll crank that up a little bit. Paint across, make my brush a little bit smaller. Paint across the top here. Now I don't want to make it completely disappear, so I'm going to try a different blend mode. Actually, I think screen works pretty well. See if I do screen and then lower the opacity a little bit. I think that's working pretty well. Now let's try another layer of paint. This will be paint bottom of dust. And again, I'm going to sample a fairly neutral color from the sand dune somewhere, maybe here. This needs to be a layer clipping mask, so Command Option G. I'll put this on color, and then I'm going to paint across the bottom here. And it kind of neutralizes it, gets it very close to the color of the sand. I think having a shadow is going to help a lot. So let's go down below the car and let's add a shadow layer. A lot of times you need to put two shadow layers, and I'll explain why in just a moment here, but I'm going to say shadow 1 and say OK. And I'm going to use my brush, and I will use a dark color from the sand dunes and paint around underneath the dust, and then around here. I've got to crank this up so that I can see it. Make my brush size a little bit smaller. Pull this around here. Now a lot of times I will put the shadow layer on a blend mode of multiply. Multiply often lets some of the texture below show through, so it looks more natural. All right, let's do a second shadow layer, because the shadow gets darker as it goes farther under the car and less light reaches it. So I will make this one a little bit darker. Come in here right underneath the car. So that looks pretty good right there. Let's change this one to multiply. All right. It's looking pretty good. Let's work on the car. So the first thing we're going to have to do on the car is separate the dust cloud from the car. So I'm going to zoom in here on the car, use the pen tool, and create a selection around the dust. Come up here, and this one I'll use quite a few points because I want it to look more organic. And I'll come up here and make a selection. Let's give it a feather of 3 and say OK. And now remember, we have to hide this area. So white reveals, black conceals. So we have to paint it with black. So I've got black in my foreground, and I will press Option Delete, which fills with the foreground color, and that hides the dust cloud on this particular layer. Command D to deselect it. And let's zoom out and take a look at this. Okay, so we know the car is very blue and very magenta, very red from its original picture. Again, if I hold the Shift key and look at it, we've got a lot of orange and blue in here. So we need to really reduce that a lot. I'm going to start again with levels. So hold down the Option key, make it a clipping mask. Say OK. And I think we do need to overall lighten the car a little bit. So in the RGB mode, I'm just going to lighten it up. And now I'm going to go into individual channels. I know I want to reduce the cyan, so that would be the red channel. So we go CMYK, remember? So it'd be cyan here. And I'm going to reduce that. And then I need to reduce the magenta. So we're getting closer to the yellow here. And this way we'll go more towards the yellow. I'm going to go back to my cyan for a minute here and see if I can get rid of a little bit more of that. Okay, I'll start out with that. I'm also going to add a hue saturation and pull out some of the saturation. We need to get this a lot more neutral so that it works with our sand dunes. All right, that looks pretty good. Now, one issue I've got is the windows. The windows are reflecting the sky from the original image. So that needs to be toned down quite a bit. So I'm going to hold down the Command spacebar or Control spacebar, zoom in here, and I'm going to create a path around the windows with my pen tool. All right, let's open up the Paths panel and double click this and name it Windows. We want to be sure to do this so that we don't lose the path. If it's just left as a work path, it will disappear if you click off it and then you start doing something else, do another path, for example, you will lose the work path. So you want to name it and that way it gets saved. So with this highlighted, we can make a selection. Another way you can make a selection, by the way, is just Command click on the thumbnail. All right, so that didn't add any feather to it at this point, but that may be okay. I'm going to show you another way to do that. So we've got this selected. I'm going to zoom out. So with it selected, let's try out curves. We haven't tried curves yet. So the way curves works is, again, we have an RGB plus individual channels for each of the colors. So the RGB will lighten it up or darken it. It increases the contrast, and you do that by clicking on this. It's like a rubber band here, and you can modify areas of light and dark throughout the image. This again is the histogram right here representing the distribution of light and dark. So let's see if we can get rid of some of the cyan. So I'll go to the red, and one way is going to go more cyan, one way is going to go less cyan. So let's go less here. And let's try the blue. If we take some blue out, and what the heck, I'll try the green too and see what happens with the green. Actually, that's helping a little bit. It's getting a little bit crunchy in here, so I'm going to reduce the opacity of that layer to make it a little less obvious. And then I want this to be selected again because I'm going to add another adjustment layer, and I want it to only affect the windows. So I'm going to Command click on this mask to load that as a selection. Let's go ahead and add a hue saturation. Pull some of the saturation out of this. And let's try shifting the color. Okay. It's looking a little bit better. Okay, now we could also try a paint layer. So again, I'll Command click, add a new layer. I'll call this one Paint, Windows. Say OK. Now this one has no mask on it. So, but I've got a selection made, so I can go ahead here and then add the mask. The adjustment layers automatically come with a mask. So if you have a selection made and you add an adjustment layer, it will create a mask that reveals the area inside the selection. Normal layers don't automatically come with masks, and so we have to add a mask. So here we've got a layer mask. I'm going to make sure I'm back on the layer, get my brush, select my color from the sand, maybe like in here, and try painting it. And let's add a color adjustment layer. And then let's try lightening this color by adding a levels to this layer. So I could hold down the Option key, add a levels, make it a clipping mask, so it's only going to affect this layer, and then we could try lightening this layer. So here's overall brightness, here's adding contrast. Okay, that's pretty good, I think. Now remember, this had a little bit of a tint to it, so I might lower the opacity of this layer slightly to let some of that bluish tint show through. Another thing is, we do have a very bright blue sky here, so we might want a little bit of the blue on the top of the car. So I'm going to click on the mask and paint with black. I'll use a very low flow, like 20 or so. If you have the airbrush mode or effect selected, you can use the numbers on your keyboard to change the flow amount. So I've got 20% flow, and I'm going to slowly reveal some of the sky. I might do it on this layer as well. So we get a little bit of the sky showing. Right now, these adjustment layers and this paint layer have layer mask, and that's what's controlling them. So they only show where they're being revealed by the mask. But we can also make all of these layer clipping masks by pressing Command-Shift-G. So they can have a layer mask and they can be a layer clipping mask. There is a little bit of a blue in the sand dunes here and over here. So I might add just a little bit of a blue to the top of the car here. I want to make a selection of the car in this case. So I'll command click on this mask of the car, add a new layer, and I'll call this blue tint. Say OK. Select some of this blue up in here. Just come down along the edge like that, and then lower the opacity quite a bit. Let's get rid of the marching ants, Command D. And I think I need to lower that a little bit more. Let's see what happens if we change it to multiply. Not much. I just want it to be really subtle. Just a touch. Something like that. Now I think the side of the car and right here in the front needs to be darker. So we'll go down to below the windows and create another layer here that will be darken front, and we will use a clipping mask. So it's going to be clipped to the car and not to the windows. I will sample one of these darker colors from sand dunes. This is probably going to be on either color or multiply. The problem is it's very hard to do color when you're going over something that's very light or very dark. So we're going to really have to do this on multiply. So I'll paint with multiply around the edge here. I'm going to add a layer mask and remove some of that. I think I will add a mask to that blue and get rid of some of that as well. Make it much more subtle. I think that's looking pretty good. Now let's deal with the sky. So I'm going to come down here above the sky, and I think I'm just going to use a couple of paint layers and then add some grain to the paint layers. So I'll call this one dark blue. We don't need to use a clipping mask because it's going to affect just what's below it. So I'll take the gradient tool over here, make sure that I'm on foreground to transparent, linear gradient. I'll sample the dark blue from the sky and then hold the shift key, click and drag. And try it again. Then I'm going to put a layer below it that'll be a lighter blue. I'll just call it mid blue. Sample this kind of turquoise color, click and drag down there. And then I will do another one below this one, and I'll call it light blue. And say OK. And for this one, I'll sample here and maybe make it a little bit more pure. That. Then click and drag. That looks kind of nice. All right, now I'm going to merge all of these together by holding the Shift key and then pressing Command E. I'll add a mask to this and reveal just a little bit more of the light top of the sand dunes and of the sky. All right, now the sky looks very smooth. That's the problem with doing paint without putting it on any kind of a blend mode. And the rest of the image has pixels. So the way we can deal with that is we can add a new layer. We'll call this one grain or noise. Change the blend mode to overlay and then click this box, fill with overlay neutral color 50% gray. So it should have also been a layer clipping mask. So I'll do Command Option G. So the thing is, when you have a layer that's filled with a neutral gray like this and it's on overlay, you can't see it. But you can add effects to it. So we can add noise to it, for example. So I'm going to come down here and add noise. If we zoom in here, you're going to see there's noise in there. Add a little bit of a blur. So it's usually around 1% blur or so. I'll say OK, and then I'm going to lower the opacity down to about somewhere around there, 60% or so. And let's zoom out. I think maybe we've got a little too much blue on the back of the car, so I'm going to go back up above the car. That would be up in this layer. And I'll take my brush, sample some of the medium dark color here, and paint that rear end. Just take out some of that blue there, maybe across the top there. Okay, I think that's looking pretty good. Let's save that puppy. In future tutorials, we will look at more advanced color correction techniques, but what you've learned today will go a long way in correcting your images. The three most valuable adjustment layers I have found are levels, curves, and hue saturation. With those three, you can make a huge difference to your image. All right, that's it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.